Now that you're ready to trim, let's talk about what tools you're going to need to trim. You're going to need 3 soft pieces of clay about the size of a golf ball. This really is the maximum amount of clay that you'll need. You may need less than that depending on how small your form is. You're also going to need your loop tool, your needle tool, your sponge, and a little bowl of water. You do not need your bat for trimming. So your first step in trimming is centering the form. You want to use the rings on the wheel head to visually line up where that form is going to go. So you do not need your bat for the trimming process. So I'm going to look at the lines on the wheel head and I'm going to line that rim up, visually centering it with those lines on the wheel head. That will definitely expedite the centering process. So now I'm going to slowly spin my wheel. The pot is not braced on, so you need to be very careful and make sure that you're spinning it very slowly. I'm going to hold that needle tool steady in my right hand. You can even support it with your left hand if that feels a little bit easier. The needle tool should be pointing away from you. So you're not holding the needle tool like this, you're pointing the needle tool away from you. And you're creating a ring on the bottom of the pot. This ring is how you can tell whether or not you're centered. Right now, I am slightly off center, and I can tell that because it is wider over here and a little thinner over here. So I'm looking at this, the widest area, and the thinnest area of this outside ring. So I'm going to be moving the pot this direction. You always move from the wide side to the thinner side. So I'm just going to slightly move my form a little at a time, and then I'm going to smooth out the ring. You should be trimming at the leather hard stage, so these rings should be pretty easy to smooth out. If they're not smoothing out so well, you can use a tiny bit of water on a sponge if you would like to smooth it out. When you're creating your rings, hold your hand steady by resting your arms on your legs. So this is my next centering ring. You can see it's still off center. It's wider over here, skinnier over there, so I'm going to move it a little bit that direction. You want to make sure you really are moving it a little at a time, otherwise you're going to constantly be going back and forth. Looking a little bit better, still wider over here, so I'm going to move it that direction. Small movements, and it is normal for it to take several attempts to center. Now I'm looking centered. Okay, so I'm going to brace the form on. Whenever you're bracing it on, and this is step 2 after centering, you want to make sure that you're holding the pot in place and you're pushing down. You need about 3 balls of clay to brace your form down. I'm trimming a relatively large form, so I have pieces of clay that are roughly the size of a golf ball, but I also have a large pot. So you can get away with smaller pieces of clay for trimming if you have a smaller pot. So I'm going to do a wiggle test to make sure that it's secure. So now I have braced the pot on. So next, I'm going to see if the base needs evened out at all. You can see that there is a raised area. So that's where I'm going to focus my energy first. I'm going to make sure that I do not have any uneven areas on the base, any bumps. I have one over here, and I'm going to trim that off first. A tip if you have a firmer pot, in other words, something that is a drier side of leather hard, you may want to kind of wet the area, moisten the area with a sponge as you go. This clay is perfect. I can tell that it is perfectly leather hard because I can easily make a mark with my thumbnail. So I want to hold the tool steady, resting my arms on my legs, and I'm going to use the outside corner of the tool. So I'm making very little contact. If you hold your tool flat when you're trimming, you're more likely to snag the clay and accidentally toss your pot off of the wheel head. So just use the corner of your tool, holding it steady, and you'll see that now only the elevated area is being removed. So my first step, and some of you will not even need to take this step. Once that tool, when I'm holding it steady, is easily going the whole way around the form, that's when I know that the raised area has been trimmed off and the base of the form is even. However, I have not yet created a foot ring. Remember, one of your purposes of trimming is that the form looks complete. We also want visual lift. So I'm going to start with trimming my outside edge first. So I'm going to take the tool, using the corner again, and remove clay. This will lighten your form. And create visual lift. There are lots of different ways to trim the foot. I'm going to create more of a rounded foot ring because I have a spiral going on in this form, and that rounded foot ring will relate a little bit better than a very angular foot ring. When you're first learning to throw, you tend to throw thick down at the bottom. So by trimming this clay away, you're definitely removing the weight from the foot of the pot, the base of the pot. So make sure that when you start trimming, that you trim the outside edge first. This will assure us that you're removing that excess weight from the outside edge. So now I'm ready to trim the inside of the foot. So I'm going to start in the middle, and I'm going to very slowly move out. Look at the rings and how close they are. This is how it should look as you're trimming. If you're creating a deep spiral, it means that you're moving out too quickly with your tool. So you need to go very slow with the movement of your tool. Your wheel should be on medium speed. If your wheel's moving too slowly, it actually can lead to very poor craftsmanship. Look how closely I'm holding that tool for control. 2 hands on the tool. Starting in the middle and slowly moving out. I felt my pot wobble a little bit there, so you want to do a little wiggle test. You see how that kind of broke a little bit loose? So I'm going to push that clay down again, no big deal. Wiggle test, it's feeling a little better. The height of the form can lead to some instability. So periodically as you're trimming, you want to stop and press gently. If the foot of that form starts to give a little bit, you know it's definitely time to stop because you don't want to trim through the bottom of your pot. However, it is very common when you're first learning. I think probably everyone will have an experience of trimming through the bottom of your form. You do not want your foot ring too wide, otherwise you're just adding weight. And remember, lightening the form is one of the purposes of trimming. So I can now really see that foot ring emerging, and I recommend that your foot ring be approximately the width of a traditional pencil. I'm going to kind of round this outside edge a little bit more, and then I'll show you how to eliminate these lines if you choose to. Some potters do leave the lines in, and that's absolutely fine. But if you want them smoothed out, you can do that as well. So I'm just removing a little bit more weight from this outside edge. Now, in order to flatten out this base, I'm still not going to push the tool completely flat. However, I realize that on the camera, it may appear that way. I'm going to use about 3/4 of this tool, and I'm using the outside edge. You're always using the outside edge of the tool, not the inside edge. The inside edge won't really do much, you see? Does a little bit, but not much. It's the outside edge that will really remove the clay. So I'm going to press that outside edge down, and you can tell where the pressure point is by what I'm removing right now. So now, like I mentioned, I wanted a rounded edge to this foot, so I'm just going to get rid of that harsh angle and kind of roll my tool over the edge. On the inside as well. So now you want to get a sponge on there and smooth and refine. So remove all of your trimmings. Get a damp sponge on there. And refine. So you're refining with that wet sponge, the outside edge, center of the foot ring, as well as the foot ring itself. And then your final step will be signing the bottom. You can use a needle tool for this. You need to use your first initial and full last name on the base of the form. Ceramics 2 creates a signature stamp, and so I'm actually going to be using my signature stamp to stamp the base of the form. Ceramics 1, again, you will use your needle tool to sign, but you want to make sure that you do not forget to sign your work. So let's talk about trying to trim pots that are a little on the stiff side. I'm still able to press my fingernail into the base of this, but this is definitely on the drier side. You can see there's some areas that are very light in color. So this is right on the verge of being too dry to trim. You're running a risk by trimming a form that's a little too stiff because it's going to release really easily from the wheel head. This clay that's meant to stick to the side and grip the pot will not grip the pot properly, so it'll be very inclined to be thrown from the wheel head. But if you still have a leather hard pot that is just a little too dry, I want to show you some tricks on how to still successfully trim that form. Just as you would any other form, you want to center your form, lining it up with the rings on the wheel head first. This is an altered form. It's going to be a mug, and a handle is going to come off of that altered area. So I need to be mindful that this altered area could affect the centering of the form to the lines on the wheel head, but it will not affect the rings on the base. So I'm going to hold that tool steady and create that circle where I can read whether or not it is centered, and it is not centered. It's wider over here, skinnier over there. Now this edge looks like it did fold over a little bit, so you have to imagine it's a little bit wider than what it is. I'm going to move it just a tiny bit that way, so it's just slightly off center. So now, smoothing out the rings with my thumb will not work because this form's a little too stiff. So I'm going to use a damp sponge, and you have to use very light pressure because this form is going to move very easily off of the wheel head. So I'm smoothing out the old ring. I'm going to go ahead and get a new ring on the base. And now I am looking centered. I might be slightly off. Let me check. So you can use your thumb as a measurement tool. Slide it down, that needle tool. No, I'm good because this edge is folded over. So I think I'm good to go. So I'm going to use this clay to brace this pot down, but I'm going to use a little bit more clay with a drier form than I need to use with a softer leather hard. This again is still considered leather hard. It's just a little bit firm, a little bit drier than ideal. So I'm going to do the wiggle test, make sure that it's on there. Before you even start trimming, you want to get some moisture on this base. That will help immensely. It will soften at least a layer of the clay, and you're going to go back and do this multiple times. You really need to take the time to hang out down at the base with a damp sponge to soften the clay. Do not let water run down the side of the pot. If you do that, then you are going to have clay, the clay that's bracing your pot on, stuck to the outside of your pot. So I'm just trimming a layer off of the outside edge. Remember to trim the outside edge first. Now you need to go back with a sponge. This is more time consuming than if you maintain your form at a softer side of leather hard. Back with that loop tool. I want to even out that outside edge. Remove the weight. I'm going to stop and do a wiggle test. Make sure that pot is still on there because again, it will release a lot easier when it's dry like this. Get that visual lift that we're looking for on that outside edge. Remove that excess weight that's typically on the bottom wall. So now I'm ready to trim the center of the form. You can hear that pot is actually starting to lift off of the wheel head. I heard a little clicking noise, so I'm going to stop. Got a little bit of a wiggle there. Brace it back on again. Go back, soften the inside. It's a lot of back and forth if you're trimming a little too stiff. I don't know if you can hear the pot. It's still moving a little bit. You can see how quickly the base dries out as I'm trimming, but I'm almost done. Now I'm ready to smooth and refine. Get those trimmings off of there. And you can leave those rings in the base if you choose to, or you can smooth them out. Then you want to sign first initial, full last name. And you're done.